"Take that cheap thing off your wrist before someone sees it," my mother whispered, her acrylic nails digging sharply into the soft skin of my inner arm. The sharp clink of crystal champagne flutes rang out to my left, cutting through the low hum of wealthy people discussing their investment portfolios. My mother leaned closer, and the heavy gardenia perfume she had sprayed on me earlier flooded my nose, thick and suffocating. The upright bass player in the corner plucked a deep, vibrating note that rattled in my chest. I twisted the thin silver band around my wrist. The metal felt like ice against my skin. "I like it, Mom," I said. Diane exhaled a sharp puff of air through her nose. "Do not speak to anyone unless they speak to you first," she ordered, her teeth practically locked together. "And if they do? You smile, you nod, and you keep it short. You are here because I need a +1 for this event, not because you have anything to contribute." I kept my right hand firmly over the silver bracelet. I was my own person. I was 28 years old. I was Riley Brennan, working 50-hour weeks as an emergency room nurse at Atrium Health Mercy, pulling in $52,000 a year, and I was still standing in the corner of a ballroom letting Diane dictate my exact movements. She had landed a job as an event coordinator at the PR firm handling the Callahan Foundation barely 3 weeks ago, and she was already working the room like she had built the entire organization from the ground up. "Then act like an adult," she snapped, instantly pivoting away to flash a bright, open smile at a passing hospital executive. A man in a tuxedo stepped up to the microphone on the center stage. He tapped the metal grill twice. The loud, hollow thuds echoed over the massive speakers, forcing the entire room into immediate silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer projected, "please welcome the founder of the Callahan Foundation, Mr. Grant Callahan." The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung inward. A man walked through them. He was tall, wearing a dark blue suit, his thick hair heavily silvered at the temples. His eyes swept over the quiet crowd with a heavy, settling gravity. Everyone leaned forward. Diane smoothed the front of her tailored dress, her posture straightening, her brilliant networking smile locking firmly into place as she stepped forward to intercept him. But Grant Callahan did not look at the local politicians. He did not look at the charity organizers. He walked straight past the waiters, holding silver trays. He walked right past my mother. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The jazz band in the corner stopped playing entirely. The silence in the room grew incredibly thick. He looked down at me. His eyes were a striking gray blue, rimmed with red and wet at the corners. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling sharply beneath his suit jacket. "After 28 years, he said, his voice a low, rough scrape against the dead quiet of the room. "I finally found you." My jaw ached fiercely. I had clamped my teeth together without realizing it. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. I stared at this billionaire, a man I had never seen before in my entire life, and tried to make sense of the words coming out of his mouth. I turned my head quickly, looking for my mother. I expected to see absolute confusion on her face. I expected to see shock or anger that a stranger was interrupting her networking event. But her face was perfectly still, completely drained of all color. Her jaw was rigid. Her eyes were wide and flat. I had seen patients in the trauma ward exhibit that exact physical expression. It was not confusion. It was unadulterated, paralyzing recognition. She knew exactly who he was. Diane shot her hand out. Her fingers clamped down on my bicep like a vice. "We are leaving," she said. "Right now." She yanked me backward, pulling me violently toward the side exit. I stumbled in the terrible pinched shoes she had forced me to wear. As we pushed blindly through the heavy velvet curtains, the man called out, his voice following us into the carpeted hallway. "Riley," he shouted. "Her name is Riley." I turned my head over my shoulder just before the wooden doors swung shut. He knew my name. My mother had never spoken my name since he walked into the room. The parking garage was freezing. The concrete walls echoed with the aggressive, rhythmic slap of Diane, hitting the pavement in her heels as she marched to her sedan. She unlocked the doors, yanked the driver's side open, and dropped into the seat. I slid into the passenger side and pulled the heavy door shut. She started the engine and threw the car into drive so hard, the transmission clunked loudly. Her knuckles stretched stark white over the black leather steering wheel, under the harsh yellow streetlights flashing by as we merged onto the highway. 3 minutes passed. 3 minutes of absolute silence was the longest I had ever gone without hearing my mother speak. The heater kicked on, blowing the concentrated scent of her gardenia perfume directly into my face. My stomach rolled. I reached for the door panel and pressed the button to roll down my window. Cold night air rushed in for exactly 1 second, before the glass glided back up and locked firmly into place. Diane kept her finger pressed hard on the master switch. She stared straight ahead at the dark asphalt. "That man is dangerous, Riley," she said. Her voice was thin, pulled tight like a piano wire. "He has been stalking me for years." I kept my hands flat on my thighs. "Stalking you?" "Mom," he said, 28 years. "He is delusional," she snapped, hitting the steering wheel with the heel of her palm. "He dated me briefly in college. A few weeks, nothing more. I broke up with him, and he never got over it." "Then why did you go pale?" I asked, watching the side of her face. "When he walked up to us, you looked terrified." "I did not go pale," she shot back. Her volume rose, filling the small cabin of the car. "Stop making things up. You always do this, Riley. You always invent this unnecessary drama." "He knew my name, Mom." He said my name out loud. She hit the brakes hard as a traffic light turned yellow, throwing me violently forward against the seatbelt strap. She turned her entire body to face me in the dim light of the dashboard. "You are so incredibly gullible," she said, her tone dripping with sudden, cold disappointment. "A strange man walks up, says one dramatic sentence, and you instantly believe him over your own mother? Over the woman who raised you entirely alone." I pressed my back against the seat. "I am just asking a simple question." "I am the one who worked 2 jobs, she continued, her voice trembling now, perfectly shifting from attack to deep injury. "I gave up my youth for you. I sacrificed everything to make sure you were safe. And this is the thanks I get? You interrogating me in a car because some billionaire psychopath decided to play a sick game?" She faced forward again and pressed the gas pedal down hard. We drove the rest of the way to my apartment in complete silence. She pulled up to the curb outside my brick building and put the car in park. Usually, she insisted on coming upstairs to check my refrigerator for expired milk or complain about the neighborhood noise. Tonight, she kept her foot firmly on the brake pedal. "Get some sleep," she commanded, not looking at me. Forget tonight ever happened. I unbuckled my seatbelt, stepped out onto the cold concrete sidewalk, and shut the door. She drove away before I even reached the front steps. The apartment was incredibly quiet, save for the low, continuous rattle of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. The bright white light from my laptop screen cast sharp shadows against the painted wall behind my small desk. I scrolled through the search results. There were hundreds of articles. Grant Callahan, Chief Executive Officer of Callahan Dynamics. Estimated net worth of $1.2 billion. Philanthropist. Board member. Widower. His wife, Ellen, had died of cancer 4 years ago. I clicked through pages of images. Grant at charity galas. Grant cutting a wide red ribbon in front of a new manufacturing plant. Grant standing beside a blonde woman in a hospital gown. I scanned every article, every biography blurb, every interview. There was absolutely no mention of any children. I glanced toward the kitchen. The green digital numbers on the microwave blinked 12:47. My right hand moved automatically to my left wrist, twisting the silver bracelet around and around. The metal was freezing against my skin, chilling my fingertips. I picked up my phone and dialed Jody. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. I gave my best friend the entire story, from the uncomfortable shoes pinching my toes to the moment Diane sped away from the curb without saying goodbye. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long time. "Jody, say something," I said, leaning my forehead against the hard edge of the desk. "Your mom looked like she had seen a ghost," Jody said. Her voice was low and serious, completely missing her usual sarcastic hospital edge. That was not surprise, Riley. That was recognition. She knew exactly who he was the second he walked in. She says he is a stalker, I offered, though the words tasted like dry ash in my mouth. She says they dated in college, and he became obsessed. A billionaire stalker who somehow knew your name. Jody asked. At an event your mom just started working for? Think about that for a second. That math does not add up at all. We hung up a few minutes later. I closed the laptop, but the glowing rectangle remained burned into my vision. 2 a.m. came and went. The apartment above me went silent. I walked into my bedroom and stared at the sliding closet doors. My chest felt tight, a dull, steady ache pressing right behind my sternum. I reached up and pulled the doors open. I knelt on the carpet and pushed aside my heavy winter coats, reaching all the way to the back corner. My fingers brushed the rough cardboard of a small moving box. It was the only box of memories Diane had allowed me to take when I moved out. The rest of my childhood was locked inside a rented storage unit in Pineville. I remembered the specific day we moved her things into that unit 2 years ago. I had reached for a heavy carton sealed with thick packing tape, and she had practically lunged across the concrete floor to snatch it out of my hands. She had told me it was just old junk, nothing important, and ordered me not to open it. I pulled the small box out of my closet now and set it on the bed. I pulled off the lid. Inside lay a chaotic pile of old report cards, a macaroni necklace from kindergarten, and my birth certificate. I picked up the thick, officially stamped paper, father listed as unknown. I traced the typed word with my thumb. Then, I dug deeper. Beneath a stack of middle school soccer photos, my fingers caught on the stiff, glossy edge of an old Polaroid photograph. It was wedged tight against the bottom seam of the cardboard. I pulled it free and held it under the yellow light of the bedside lamp. The colors were faded, washed out by decades of time, but the image was completely unmistakable. Diane stood in the center of the frame. She looked young, maybe 25. Her hair was its natural dark brown, long before she started bleaching it into perfect blonde submission. She was heavily pregnant, her hands resting protectively on a very round stomach. Standing right beside her, with his arm wrapped securely around her waist, was a man. His hand rested on top of hers, right over the baby. Over me! He was smiling. The camera flash illuminated his eyes. They were a striking, unmistakable, gray, blue. I walked slowly into the bathroom, carrying the photograph in my right hand. I flipped on the harsh vanity light and looked directly into the mirror above the sink. I looked at the dark circles under my eyes, the messy brown hair I kept tied back for 12-hour shifts at the hospital. And then I looked at my irises, gray, blue. I looked down at the photograph, then back up at my own reflection, tracking the exact shape, the exact color. They were identical. The man in the picture was the man from the ballroom. The man my mother claimed was a delusional stalker she barely knew. A wave of physical nausea washed over me, starting in my stomach and radiating out to my fingertips. My birth certificate said, unknown. Every single time I had ever asked about him, every time I had cried as a child wanting to know why I did not have a dad, she had looked me right in the eye and told me he was a mistake who vanished before she even knew she was pregnant. But she knew. She had always known. She had posed for a picture with him. He had placed his hand over her stomach. He had smiled. I walked back into the living room and placed the photograph flat on the surface of the desk. I unclasped the thin silver bracelet from my wrist and set it down right next to the picture. 2 things my mother had always told me were cheap, meaningless garbage. 2 things that were currently telling a completely different story. I opened my laptop again. I went to the contact page for Callahan Dynamics. I typed a single sentence into the message box. My finger hovered over the trackpad, resting right above the word, send. I pressed down on the trackpad. The reply hit my inbox exactly 11 minutes later. 3 days after that, on a Tuesday afternoon, I pushed open the heavy glass door of Amelie's French Bakery in the Noda neighborhood. I had chosen this place specifically because it was public. The music was always too loud, and I knew half the staff working behind the pastry counter. If I needed an escape route, I had three: the sharp hiss of the espresso machine and the heavy, sweet smell of burnt sugar and dark roasted coffee settled my racing pulse just a fraction. Grant Callahan was already sitting at a small, scarred wooden table in the far corner. He wore a simple button-down shirt. The sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, revealing thick wrists and hands that looked like they had actually worked for a living before he became a billionaire. I sat down across from him. The wooden chair scraped loudly against the tile floor. He did not speak right away. He waited until a barista walked past us with a tray of clattering ceramic cups. Then he pushed a plain white envelope across the table. "Your mother and I dated for 2 years, Riley," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands remained flat on the table, his fingers pressing hard into the wood. "I was building my first company out of a garage. She was working at a bank downtown. We were in love. Or, at least, I completely believed we were. When she told me she was pregnant, I was thrilled. I bought a ring. I asked her to marry me." I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, hiding the slight tremor in my fingers. "She told me my father was a stranger. A mistake. 3 weeks after I proposed," Grant continued, his jaw tightening so hard the muscle jumped beneath his skin, "she completely disappeared. She stopped answering my calls. She moved out of her apartment without a forwarding address. When she finally answered the phone a month later, she told me she had lost the baby. She said the grief was too much, and she could not bear to see me anymore." I watched his face. The lines around his mouth deepened. "I was completely devastated," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I tried to find her, to help her through it. But she blocked every attempt. I eventually moved to Charleston. I built my company. I married my wife, Ellen, and I tried to build a life." "Why are you here now?" I asked. "After 28 years? 3 months ago," Grant said, pulling his hands back from the table. "Someone emailed me a photograph. It was a picture of a young woman in a nursing cap. She had my mother's eyes." "Who sent it?" I asked, my heart knocking against my ribs. "I do not know," he replied. "It was an anonymous account, but the subject line of the email was very clear. It said, 'She does not know you exist. Ask Diane Brennan why.'" He tapped the thick white envelope resting between us. "Inside is a DNA test kit," he said. "You do not have to do this, Riley. But I spent the last 3 months hiring private investigators to make absolutely sure I was not chasing a ghost. They confirmed Diane had a daughter. Your exact age, living in your exact city. Wearing your face." I looked down at the white paper square. It was a choice. For my entire life, my identity had been handed to me by my mother. I was the abandoned daughter. I was the burden she had bravely carried alone. Reaching for that envelope meant stepping entirely outside the boundaries she had built around me. I reached out, pinched the corner of the envelope, and slid it toward my edge of the table. The email with the laboratory results arrived on a Friday evening right in the middle of my shift at the hospital. I stepped away from the chaotic noise of the nurses' station, walked into the staff restroom, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile white glow over the sink. I leaned my hip against the cool porcelain and opened the document attachment on my phone. Probability of paternity is 99.98%. I read the number 3 times. The air left my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. The solid ground beneath my feet felt like it had turned to water. 2 hours later, my shift ended. I did not go home. I drove straight to the Myers Park neighborhood and parked my car in the wide, paved driveway of the townhouse Diane shared with Keith. I walked up the brick path and let myself in through the front door. The house smelled like expensive candles and roasted chicken. Diane was standing in the large, pristine kitchen, pouring a glass of white wine. She turned around, a bright, rehearsed smile forming on her mouth before she registered the rigid posture of my shoulders. I walked over to the granite island and set the printed DNA results flat on the stone. She glanced down, saw the bold black numbers, and instantly stepped back. Her hand gripped the stem of her wine glass so hard I thought the crystal might shatter. "Those tests can be faked," she said. Her voice dropped immediately into a hard, defensive register. "He has billions of dollars, Riley. He paid someone for that piece of paper." I did not raise my voice. I kept my hands perfectly still at my sides. "Mom, he sent birthday cards. Every single year. He showed me the photocopies. 30 envelopes. Return to sender. Your exact handwriting was on every single one of them." "He did not send anything," she hissed, her eyes darting toward the hallway to ensure Keith was not listening. "You are letting a total stranger manipulate you." "I saw the postmarks," I replied, watching her chest rise and fall rapidly. "I saw the letters he wrote to me." Diane slammed her glass down on the counter. The pale wine sloshed over the rim, pooling on the white marble. Her eyes filled with rapid, brilliant tears. It was a violent, seamless shift from absolute rage to utter victimhood. "I gave up everything for you," she cried, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I worked 2 jobs. I had no social life. I had no relationships for years, just to make sure you were taken care of. You want to replace me with a billionaire? After everything I sacrificed?" She walked quickly around the island, reaching out to grab my forearms. Her grip was tight and desperate. Her nails dug into my skin. "You are all I have, Riley," she wept, demanding that I comfort her, demanding that I fold myself back into the shape she required. I looked down at her hands holding me in place. "I was protecting you," she sobbed, tears spilling over her perfectly applied makeup. "From what?" I asked, pulling my arms free from her grip. "From a father who actually wanted me?" Her mask slipped for a fraction of a second. The tears remained on her cheeks, but her eyes went completely, terrifyingly cold. She stood there, frozen in the kitchen, as I turned around and walked out the front door into the darkening night. The next morning, I sat on a vinyl couch in the hospital break room next to Jody. I stared at the blank wall, running my thumb over the silver bracelet on my wrist. I told her exactly what Diane had said in the kitchen. I told her about the tears, the accusations, the heavy, suffocating guilt that Diane had tried to drop on my shoulders. Jody took a long sip of her terrible hospital coffee. She did not offer me platitudes. "My mother lied to me for 15 years about my dad," Jody said quietly, staring into her paper cup. "He blew through their savings, remortgaged the house, and almost lost everything. She covered it up. She told me we could not afford college because of a bad investment. She said she was protecting the family image." Jody turned her head and looked directly at me. "Protection and control look completely identical from the outside, Riley," she said, her voice dropping low. "The only difference is who it actually serves." By the middle of the second week, I found myself sitting in an environment that felt completely alien. The lawyer's office sat on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in uptown Charlotte. The wide windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline. The room smelled powerfully of old paper, lemon furniture polish, and very expensive leather. I sat in a massive wingback chair that swallowed me whole. I had to come straight from a 12-hour shift at the emergency room. I was still wearing my faded blue scrubs and scuffed white sneakers. Grant sat in the leather chair right next to me, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. The contrast in the room was impossible to ignore. I was a girl making $52,000 a year, sitting in an office that easily billed $800 an hour. The lawyer sitting behind the dark mahogany desk opened a thick green folder. He cleared his throat and explained the financial history. Grant's mother, Margaret Callahan, had passed away 8 years ago. Before she died, she had established a family trust fund. Grant had firmly believed he would never have children, as his late wife had been entirely unable to conceive, but his mother had insisted on setting up the account anyway, just in case he ever had a biological heir. The trust had started at $200,000. Over the years, with aggressive investments and compounding interest, it had grown to $620,000. As the only verified biological child of Grant Callahan, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, You are the sole legal beneficiary of this trust. I stopped breathing. $620,000. It was a number so large it did not feel real. It was enough to wipe out my massive student loans in a single afternoon. It was enough to buy a house. It was enough to change the entire trajectory of my life. The lawyer reached into the green folder and slid a single piece of paper across the polished wood. 15 years ago, the lawyer continued, his tone perfectly flat and professional. The firm administering the trust sent a legal notice to your mother. It informed her of the account's existence. We have the certified mail receipt. She absolutely received it. I picked up the heavy paper. It was a photocopy of a formal legal declaration. And 6 months later, the lawyer said, folding his hands together, she signed this document in front of a notary and mailed it back to the trust administrator in Charleston. I read the highlighted paragraph at the bottom of the page. The letters blurred together for a second, before snapping into sharp, horrific focus. The beneficiary described is deceased. I have no living children fathered by Grant Callahan. The silence in the office was absolute. I looked up at the lawyer, then over at Grant. She told them I was dead? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Legally, she signed a sworn statement, the lawyer replied. That is fraud, Riley. That is forgery. I held the piece of paper in my hands. The sharp edges dug into my palms. This was supposed to be the grand moment of victory. I had a father sitting right next to me. I had an inheritance that could secure my future forever. I had concrete, undeniable, legally binding proof that my mother was a liar. But sitting in that expensive leather chair, surrounded by mahogany and skyline views, I felt absolutely hollow. The number on the trust document was massive, but it could not buy back the 28 years of my life. $620,000 could not purchase the smell of a father's cologne when I was 5 years old, learning to ride a bicycle. It could not buy back the empty chair at my nursing school graduation. It could not erase the thousands of times I had looked in the mirror and wondered why I was not enough for a man to stay. I looked over at Grant. His jaw was clenched tight. His blue eyes locked on the forged document trembling in my hands. He was a billionaire, a man who commanded entire industries, but he had been robbed just as completely as I had. We were two strangers sitting in a high-rise tower, mourning a lifetime that had been stolen from us by a woman who claimed to love me more than life itself. Grant leaned forward and rested his elbows heavily on his knees. He looked directly at me, his expression grim and exhausted. Your mother will fight this, he warned quietly. She will not simply walk away from this discovery. She does not lose, not when her entire story is at stake. I looked back down at the photocopy in my hands. Right next to the typed word deceased was a signature in black ink. It was the exact same looping cursive that had signed my 5th grade field trip permission slips. It was the exact same handwriting that had penned the grocery lists on our refrigerator. It was the same hand that had cooked my dinners and braided my hair before school. It was the same hand that had calmly and deliberately erased my entire existence with a single pen stroke. Grant was absolutely right. Diane did not retreat. She did not take a moment to reflect or process the massive lie that had just been dragged out into the open. Instead, she launched a fully coordinated offensive across 3 separate battlefields simultaneously. By the middle of the 3rd week, the fallout reached the hospital. I sat in the cramped break room at Atrium Health Mercy, trying to force down a bite of a stale granola bar. My phone vibrated violently against the cheap laminate table. It had been buzzing non-stop for 48 hours. I picked it up and stared at the glowing screen. A local gossip blog called Charlotte Scoop had just published a new article. The headline was plastered across the top of the page in bold black font. Local nurse, targeted by wealthy tech chief executive officer, mother speaks out. The framing of the story was an absolute masterpiece of manipulation. Grant was painted as an obsessed, predatory billionaire, using his vast wealth and corporate lawyers to harass a naive young woman. Diane was framed as the heroic, terrified mother desperately trying to protect her innocent daughter from a powerful, dangerous man. The comments section beneath the article was already flooded with hundreds of replies. Absolute strangers called me a gold digger, a homewrecker, and an idiot. They debated my character. They debated my mother's bravery. The second front of her attack was a relentless social siege. Diane had systematically called every single person in my contacts list she could reach. She called my aunts in Raleigh. She called her friends from the Sunday morning church group. She even tracked down former coworkers from my old clinic. She fed them her twisted, tear-soaked version of events. She cried over the phone, claiming I was being brainwashed and held hostage by the promise of Grant's massive wealth. The small network of support I thought I had built in Charlotte began to dissolve instantly. People I had known for a decade suddenly looked at me with deep suspicion. The head charge nurse walked past the break room, shooting a sideways, pitying glance at me before quickly looking away. I could hear whispers near the sterile supply closet. Someone had definitely pulled up the article on the floor computer. My hard-earned professional reputation was burning down around me, becoming collateral damage in a war my mother had started 28 years ago. The third front was a direct, unrelenting bombardment. My phone vibrated in my scrub pocket again. I pulled it out and watched the green text bubbles roll in. 47 text messages had arrived in a single night. She alternated her tactics with dizzying, sickening speed. 1 minute, she sent, "I love you more than life itself. Please come home." The next minute, the tone violently shifted to, "After everything I sacrificed for you, you are destroying our entire family for a check." And finally, the ultimate weapon she always kept loaded in her arsenal. "You are killing me, Riley. Literally killing me." That evening, I sat alone at the small kitchen island in my apartment. A bowl of cheap instant noodles sat in front of me, completely cold, the salty chicken broth congealing around the edges of the ceramic bowl. My phone was plugged into the wall charger. The battery was almost completely dead, but the screen immediately lit up again. I watched 3 new voicemails register from older women in Diane's church group. The overhead light above my tiny stove flickered rapidly. The bulb was dying, and I had been too exhausted to drive to the hardware store to replace it. Through the thin drywall ceiling, I could hear the muffled, angry shouts of the couple upstairs having another screaming match. The apartment smelled like salty, powdered soup and stale, trapped air. My phone rang again. It was not a local Charlotte number. It was Grant. I picked up the device and pressed the speaker firmly to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse and ragged. "Riley," Grant said. His tone was noticeably different tonight. It was tight, carefully measured, and strictly formal. "My legal team is advising me to step back. Temporarily." I stopped staring at the cold noodles. My fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter. "Step back. The blog post," he explained, his breathing heavy and strained through the receiver. "Diane's narrative is gaining serious traction online. My board of directors is extremely concerned about the public optics. A billionaire pursuing a young nurse, the framing is highly problematic for the company's reputation and our current shareholders." "I know exactly what the framing is," I said, my grip tightening on the plastic phone case until my knuckles ached. "I am not abandoning you," he insisted quickly, though his voice lacked its usual heavy gravity. "I just need to be strategic about how we proceed. We have to let this media cycle cool down before we make another legal move. My mother told me my father did not want me for 28 years, I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, trembling with a cold, terrifying clarity. "And now, you are telling me to wait." A long, agonizing silence stretched across the cellular connection. "I am incredibly sorry," Grant finally whispered. "I will make this right. I just need a little time." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. The screen went completely black. I was utterly, entirely alone. It was exactly where Diane wanted me. Without Grant's resources, without my friends, I was isolated on an island of her making. 5 minutes later, the dark screen lit up again. The caller identification displayed Keith's name. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, swiped the screen, and held the phone up. "Hello," I said flatly. "Riley, honey," Keith said, his voice soft, placating, and deeply apologetic. Your mama is absolutely devastated. She is not eating a thing. She cries all night long in the living room. Keith, please stop, I said, rubbing the tight muscles of my forehead. Just come over to the house, he pleaded gently. Just sit down and talk to her. She loves you more than anything in this entire world. I stopped rubbing my head. A cold, sudden realization washed over me. I thought about the timeline Grant had laid out in the coffee shop. I thought about the anonymous email that had set this entire nightmare into motion. Keith, I said slowly, measuring every single syllable. Did you know? About Grant? The line went dead silent. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. I really think you should talk to your mother, he finally said, completely avoiding the direct question. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I registered the evasion instantly. He did not say no. He did not deny sending the email. He deflected. But I was entirely too exhausted to press him on it tonight. My newly discovered father was retreating to protect his corporate boardroom. My mother was attacking the local media to protect her lifelong lies. The public narrative was cementing solidly against me. I looked down at the silver bracelet, resting heavily on my left wrist. It no longer felt like a piece of jewelry. It felt exactly like a heavy shackle pulling me straight to the bottom of the ocean. At 2 a.m, I was sitting flat on the hard floor of my bathroom. My back was pressed against the freezing porcelain edge of the bathtub. The square ceramic tiles were biting through the thin cotton fabric of my sweatpants. The harsh fluorescent vanity light buzzed loudly overhead, casting a sickly yellow glare over the small, cramped room. It felt exactly like sitting on the floor of the emergency room break area after a brutal, catastrophic trauma code. The bathroom floor was the only place I knew how to exist when my central nervous system was entirely overloaded and shutting down. My phone lay face down on the bath mat next to my knee. Diane had sent 30 more text messages since midnight. Every single message was a perfectly crafted, poisoned hook. If I replied to just one, if I offered a single word of defense or anger, she would reel me back in, and the suffocating cycle would start all over again. I stood up, grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter, and walked out the door. I drove the 10 minutes to Jody's house. The dark streets of Charlotte completely abandoned. At this late hour, I knocked softly on her front door at 2:30. She opened it wearing an oversized gray shirt, took one look at my pale face, and stepped aside without asking a single question. We sat at her kitchen island while she boiled water on the stove. Her 5-year-old daughter, Piper, was fast asleep down the hallway. Jody poured 2 mugs of hot chamomile tea and slid one across the cool granite counter. Maybe she is right, Jody, I whispered, wrapping my freezing hands around the hot ceramic mug. I was not telling a story. I was offering a complete, unconditional surrender. Maybe I should just let it all go. I survived 28 years without knowing the truth. I can survive the rest of my life. You can survive a lot of things, Riley, Jody said, sitting down across from me. Her voice was incredibly firm, completely devoid of any soft pity. That does not mean you should have to. He pulled back, I said, staring blindly into the dark amber liquid. Grant pulled back to protect his company and his board members. I have no lawyer. I have no money to fight her in court. I have absolutely nothing. You have a legally binding DNA test, Jody countered, tapping her short fingernail aggressively against the counter. You have forged legal documents. You have the truth. The truth? I laughed, a harsh, dry, scraping sound that hurt my throat. The truth is that my mother would rather tell the entire world I was dead than let me have a father. The kitchen went completely, utterly still. Jody stopped moving. She stared at me over the rim of her steaming cup. Say that again, she commanded. She told them I was dead, I repeated, the words tasting like copper on my tongue. And right there, sitting on a wooden stool in a quiet kitchen in the middle of the night, the massive tectonic plates of my reality finally shifted. It was not a sudden explosion of fiery rage. It was not a burning, cinematic desire for revenge. It was a wave of absolute, terrifying clarity that washed the fog completely out of my brain. Diane had not just hidden a wealthy father from me. She had legally murdered me on a piece of paper. She had sat in a quiet room 15 years ago, looked at a formal legal form, looked at the name of her only living daughter, and calmly written the word deceased. This was never about protecting an innocent child from a powerful man. This was about absolute ownership. I was not Diane's daughter. I was Diane's possession. I belonged to her, completely and exclusively. And if she had to kill my legal identity to maintain that total ownership, she would do it without a single second of hesitation. My entire life had been defined by what I desperately wanted. I had wanted her to love me. I had wanted her to tell me the truth. I had wanted her to simply accept me. But that deep, aching want vanished in an instant, burning away in the cold, bright light of realization. I did not need her acceptance anymore. I did not need Grant's corporate money or his high-priced lawyers. I needed to declare my own existence. I am alive. I am not your ghost. What are you going to do? Jody asked softly, watching my rigid posture completely change. I looked down at my left wrist. I looked at the heavy silver bracelet. For the first time in my entire life, I did not see cheap metal from a weekend flea market. I saw concrete, undeniable evidence. A young man had bought this for the woman carrying his child. Someone had wanted me to exist. I am going to file the fraud claim myself, I told her, my voice completely steady and anchored. I do not need Grant's legal team or his money. I need a paralegal and the absolute truth. Jody glanced at the digital clock glowing faintly on the stove. It is 3 a.m. I know, I said, lifting the hot mug to my lips. I have a 12-hour shift in exactly 5 hours. Jody reached for the heavy kettle and poured more steaming water into my cup. Then you better drink fast. On Tuesday morning, I sat in a small, cluttered office near the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. Jody had introduced me to a solo practice civil litigation attorney who had handled her messy divorce 3 years prior. The lawyer listened to my entire story, reviewed the printed DNA results, and read the photocopy of the forged trust document. He agreed to take the case on a contingency basis, taking 25% of the trust fund if we won. I did not have to pay a single dollar up front. The evidence was overwhelming, and the trust company in Charleston was already signaling their willingness to cooperate. By Thursday afternoon, my attorney officially filed a civil fraud complaint against Diane Brennan. The charges were brutal and precise. Misrepresentation to a trust administrator, forging a sworn statement, declaring a beneficiary deceased, and the conversion of trust assets by fraudulent concealment. I did not need a billionaire and his team of high-priced corporate lawyers. I had my own attorney. It was my case, built entirely on my terms. I also sent a certified letter directly to the trust administrator in South Carolina, attaching the DNA results and my birth certificate, formally demanding they reopen the trust claim. That same afternoon, I sat in my apartment and dialed Keith. He answered on the first ring. I kept my voice perfectly level. You did not say no when I asked if you knew the truth, I told him. I need you to tell me exactly what you know. Not for Grant. Do it for me. Keith was quiet for 10 long seconds. I could hear him breathing heavily into the receiver. Can we meet? He finally asked. Friday night, I said. The Fig Tree Restaurant. 7 o'clock. Tell me everything you know. I hung up and immediately dialed Grant. I filed the fraud claim myself today, I told him. My lawyer. My case. I am not asking you to fight this battle for me, Grant. I am asking you to be there when I finish it. I will be there, he promised. The strategy had entirely changed. The old version of me would have waited for a powerful father to fix my broken life. The new version built her own team. Every single person who was going to walk into that restaurant on Friday night was coming because I invited them. I arrived at the Fig Tree Restaurant in the Elizabeth neighborhood 20 minutes early. I requested a specific table in the back corner of the dining room and sat with my back firmly against the wall. It was pure muscle memory from the emergency room. You never sit with your back to the door. The restaurant was semi-public, quiet enough for an intimate conversation, but crowded enough to prevent anyone from screaming. The table was illuminated by a single white candle. The air smelled rich and comforting, a mixture of warm baked bread and roasting garlic. Soft jazz music played from invisible speakers in the ceiling. Diane arrived exactly at 7. Keith walked behind her, guiding her to the table before taking a seat at the empty bar across the room. She did not know Keith and I had spoken. She slid into the booth across from me. Draping her linen napkin over her lap, she flashed a confident, patronizing smile. "I am so glad you finally came to your senses, sweetheart," she purred. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl accusations. I felt completely, terrifyingly calm, and I saw her eyes narrow as she registered the total lack of emotion on my face. "Mom, I want you to hear me," I said evenly. "I want you to really hear me." "Of course, baby," she said, leaning forward. "I filed a fraud complaint this week," I stated, keeping my hands folded on the white tablecloth. "In civil court. Against you." Her patronizing smile fractured into a dozen sharp pieces. "What?" she gasped. I reached down, lifted a thick manila folder from the seat beside me, and placed it on the table. I opened it slowly. "This is the DNA test," I said, pointing to the first page. "This is the trust fund notification you received 15 years ago. And this is the copy of the document you signed, declaring me legally dead." I tapped my finger against the bottom line. "Your signature, Mom. Your handwriting. A sworn statement to a trust administrator saying, 'I do not exist.'" Diane swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically around the restaurant. "That is fake," she stammered. "They faked that. Grant and his people are setting me up. The original document is sitting in the trust company archive," I replied, "with your notarized signature. They are fully cooperating with my claim." She instantly shifted to her second line of defense. The tears arrived right on cue, pooling in her eyes and spilling over her dark mascara. I was terrified. "Riley," she wept softly, reaching across the table. "He was so powerful. I was just a 25-year-old girl, and he had all that money and those terrifying lawyers." I pulled my hands back out of her reach. "You were 25 when I was born," I corrected her. "You were 40 years old when you signed that specific document. 15 years later, what exactly were you so scared of at 40, Mom?" She opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. Before she could invent an answer, Keith stood up from his stool at the bar. He walked slowly across the dining room floor and stopped right next to our table. Diane looked up at him, her tear-stained face twisting in genuine confusion. "Keith, what are you doing?" she asked. "I sent the email, Diane," he said. The remaining color drained completely out of my mother's face. She looked whiter than she had at the gala. "3 months ago," Keith continued, his voice shaking but resolute. "I found the sealed box in your storage unit in Pineville while I was helping you clean it out. The letters from Grant. The birthday cards. 28 years of birthday cards addressed to a little girl you told everyone did not have a father." He looked down at his rough hands. "My granddaughter is your exact age, Riley." I kept looking at those cards, and I kept thinking, what if someone did this to Sophie? What if someone told her father she did not exist? Keith took a deep breath and looked directly at me. "The storage unit is full of them. Hundreds of letters. And the original legal notice from the trust fund, with Diane's handwriting in the margins saying do not respond." The heavy front door of the restaurant opened. Grant walked in. He walked directly to our table, his presence commanding the space, just as it had in the ballroom. He did not bring lawyers. He came as my witness. The optics had shifted entirely. I was no longer a helpless nurse being pursued. I was a daughter exposing a massive financial fraud. Grant looked down at the table, his eyes sweeping over the documents. Then, he looked at my left wrist. He froze. "Where did you get that bracelet?" he asked, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. "Mom gave it to me when I was 16, I answered, watching Diane shrink back into the dark leather booth. "She told me it was cheap junk from a flea market." Grant placed his heavy hands on the edge of the table. I had it custom made, he said softly. Solid sterling silver. A custom clasp. I gave it to your mother the very night she told me she was pregnant. No one at the surrounding tables moved. The jazz track ended, and for 3 full seconds, the only sound in the restaurant was the faint clink of a glass being set down somewhere near the bar. She told me she lost it the day she left me, Grant whispered. I looked down at the silver band. She had kept it for 16 years, after walking away from Grant, called it garbage, and then clasped it around my wrist on my 16th birthday. For 12 years, I had worn the physical proof of her lie against my skin every single day, completely blind to what it actually meant. Grant stood up straight. He did not say another word to her. He did not need to. His physical presence in the room was the final nail in the coffin of her elaborate narrative. Diane looked at Keith, then at me, and finally at Grant. We were 3 people she had manipulated, controlled, and lied to for decades. We were all standing together, and she was entirely alone. She picked up her leather purse, her hands shaking violently. She slid out of the booth and walked toward the exit. Not a single person tried to stop her. I stood in the restaurant parking lot under the orange glow of a tall street lamp. The cold night air hit my face, and the massive spike of adrenaline that had sustained me through the dinner finally began to wear off. My hands started to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor traveling up my arms. Grant stood right next to me, his hands buried deep in his dark wool coat pockets. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just watched the red taillights of passing cars fade into the distance. I should have fought harder, Grant finally said, his voice rough against the wind. 28 years ago, when she called and told me about the miscarriage, I should have driven to her apartment. I should have demanded medical proof. I shoved my shaking hands into my jacket pockets. You were 27 years old, I told him. You completely trusted someone you loved. So were you, he replied, turning his head to look at me. She was your mother. He was right. Both of us had been trapped inside her narrative, paralyzed by our love for a woman who viewed us as nothing more than props in her own tragic play. What do you need from me, Riley? He asked quietly. Not what I want to give you. Tell me what you actually need. I need time, I answered honestly. I need time to figure out exactly who I am when I am not busy surviving someone else's lie. Grant nodded slowly. He did not push. He did not offer me $1 million or demand a relationship right then and there. He just accepted my boundary. It was a profoundly bittersweet moment. We shared biology, and we shared a devastating loss, but we did not share 28 years of memories. That grief was heavy and real, and absolutely no amount of money in a trust fund was ever going to fix it. 3 months later, I woke up in my apartment on a bright Saturday morning. It was the exact same studio in the No-Da neighborhood. I had the same cracked kitchen tiles, the same buzzing refrigerator, and the same aggressively loud neighbors arguing upstairs. But the energy in the small space was entirely different. I walked over to the fridge to grab the milk. On the white door, secured by a cheap plastic magnet, was a brand new photograph. It was a picture of Grant and me standing together at the local farmers market last weekend. Right next to it was a picture of Jody, Piper, and me sitting on a beach towel during a recent day trip to the coast. There were absolutely no pictures of Diane anywhere in the apartment. Sunlight streamed through the single window above the sink. The rich, earthy smell of roasting coffee beans drifted up from the cafe on the street below, mixing with the steam rising from my own drip coffee maker. I reached for my ceramic mug, the heavy silver bracelet sliding comfortably down my wrist. The legal situation was unspooling exactly as slowly as reality dictated. The trust claim was officially pending. The trust administrator in Charleston had legally recognized me as the rightful beneficiary. Diane was attempting to contest the claim, but the attorney Keith had quietly recommended to her after the dinner. His last decent gesture before moving out of the townhouse had laid out the brutal truth. She had forged a sworn legal document, and the absolute burden of proof rested entirely on her shoulders. The civil fraud case was moving through the court system. I had instructed my lawyer not to push for criminal charges. A civil victory was more than enough. Diane would eventually be forced to pay all of the legal costs, and I would receive the trust fund in 6 to 12 months. Diane had not contacted me. She had moved out of Keith's townhouse in Myers Park and relocated to a small apartment back in Pineville, living with an old friend from high school. She was not completely destroyed, but she had been drastically diminished. She had lost the audience for her 28-year performance. She had lost Keith, she had lost me, and she had lost control of the narrative. She was still breathing, but the myth of the heroic, sacrificing single mother was dead and buried. Later that afternoon, I sat in the break room at Atrium Health Mercy during a brief lull in my emergency room shift. My phone vibrated on the table. It was a text message from Grant. Headed to Charlotte today. Coffee after your shift. I smiled, picked up the phone, and replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. There was no grand ceremony between us. There were no dramatic declarations of love. We were building a relationship slowly, deliberately, one cup of coffee and one Saturday afternoon at a time. I set the phone down and looked at my left wrist. I stared at the silver metal catching the harsh hospital light. I finally understood the true weight of the object. It was not cheap. It had never been from a flea market. A young man had purchased this heavy silver band for the woman carrying his unborn child. And that woman had kept it, not out of sentimental love, but out of a dark, twisted sense of possession. But the reason I had worn it every single day for 12 years was entirely different now. I wore it because it was a constant, physical reminder that I had always been wanted. Even when I was completely unaware of his existence, my father had wanted me. The heavy wooden door to the break room swung open, and Jody walked in carrying a stack of fresh medical charts. She dropped them on the table, pulled out a plastic chair, and collapsed into it with a heavy sigh. She looked across the table at me, noticing the relaxed slope of my shoulders and the quiet stillness in my hands. "You good?" she asked, raising a tired eyebrow. I picked up my stethoscope and stood up from the table. "Yeah," I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. "I am really good." It was not a dramatic statement. It was not a roaring battle cry. It was just a simple, quiet sentence. And for the first time in 28 years, it was the absolute truth.